Dan, you made a tremendous mistake. You said I had come here to Palo Alto. You know Stanford is not in Palo Alto. Stanford is in Stanford, California, as I hope you tell everybody who believes we are in Palo Alto, a widespread misconception about us. This is for me a homecoming because after I stepped down as president of Stanford, I taught the first quarter of Introduction to the Humanities in this very room for 4 years. So I associate very lively debates with Bishop, and I hope we will have a lively session today. Now, my assignment in a way is to talk about self-fashioning, and that's of course a very difficult term, and I will make a comment. So I have decided that I will do something that I normally don't do, and that is talk about my life, talk about how I got from there to here. And I have actually never done that in public, but last year I spent a year in Berlin acting as president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I was invited to Weimar to talk about basically a life for the university and about how I got from Hamburg to Stanford. So that forced me to think about matters I had not thought about and that are in some way the core of your quarter. Now, let me begin with the very simple statement that I was born on Christmas Day, 1937 in Hamburg. I'm ancient by your standards, of course. I don't feel like particularly ancient, but 1937, that is before World War II. And indeed, World War II began 2 years later. I was born in 1937, and Germany attacked Poland in 1939. In 1944, I was enrolled in elementary school, and the war came to an end the following May. My childhood memories are mostly memories of the war, especially the air raids. Hamburg was a major target, in particular, of the British Air Force. The air raids and a deep sense of fear and insecurity among the ruins. One of the most dramatic events of World War II on the German side was a bombing raid in 1943 that triggered a firestorm that lasted for 3 days and that not only killed many people but presented tremendous challenges. I'm saying that because I think there was a lesson to learn from that, and that is, how did local populations in Germany or in the other countries that were attacked by Germany, how did they experience the war? And I think the most important insight I had was that the war was a natural disaster. We thought about it just in terms of surviving. And it was not so much, the air raids on Hamburg were not so much a political thing for which one blamed somebody like the famous bomber Harris, but rather it was experienced by local populations in Germany and in the countries Germany had attacked, to a large extent as a natural disaster. I think we should think of that as we see what is happening in Aleppo and similar places. The United States engaged in carpet bombing of Hanoi to demoralize the population of Vietnam. But in reality, I'm sure the Vietnamese reacted the same way, and that is, for them it was a natural disaster, and you think all the time about what do I have to do to survive. Though I do not recall political discussions at home before 1945, I do know that my father refused to join the party, the Nazi party, the organization Hitler had formed to organize his rule. And in the last months of the war, my father and others in the age group 16 to 60 were conscripted into a people's militia, the completely futile and shameless last-ditch effort of the Nazis. So all of this are kind of general memories, but as I said, I do not remember discussions about the Nazi regime and about Hitler before 1945. But I can pinpoint with great precision the beginning of my political memory. On April 30, 1945, Hitler had committed suicide. On the 2nd of May, 1945, on the 2nd of May, this is really the day on which my political memory begins. On the 2nd of May, 1945, the Nazi governor of Hamburg announced over the radio that he would surrender the city to the British Second Army the next day. The capitulation was contrary to orders of the Hitler government issued as recently as April 22nd. Now, why do I remember this occasion so vividly? Because I remember this incredible sense of relief on the part of the adults, right? I was all of 7 years old. Just think of yourself at age 7 and how you would react to emotions in the family circle. And in this case, it was the fact that my parents, my brother, had this tremendous sense of relief when they were told that there would be no effort made to defend Hamburg against the British, though that is what the Reich government had ordered. After the unprecedented horrors that Germany had brought to the world, it was very difficult for a young German to develop any patriotism, even identification with Germany, other than on the local level. Growing up in Hamburg in the post-war period, I did cultivate a certain Hamburg identity. Now, I should say, because many of you, of course, identify with the places you grew up in, sometimes you reject them. I remember when my daughter, who was an undergraduate at Yale, the first year, whom did she identify with? Other people from Chicago. That was her reference point. And in a way, that was my experience. She was born in Chicago and we lived there then. That was something like that was my reference point. Now, Hamburg, now a city-state in the Federal Republic, is formally known as the Free and Hanseatic City of Hamburg. Free refers to the fact that at the end of the 12th century, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa gave Hamburg the status of a free city within the empire with various tax, commercial, and other privileges. Hanseatic refers to the fact that Hamburg was one of the founding members of the Hanseatic League, a trading compact, almost confederation, of about 70 North European cities whose economic influence over several centuries reached from Novgorod in Russia to Visby in Sweden and to London. The Hanseatic League lasted from the 12th century to the 17th century. Actually, quite formally dissolved, it was only in the 19th century. There were 3 remaining members of the Hanseatic League, Hamburg and Bremen and Lübeck. But many non-German cities were part of it. Hamburg for centuries was strongly oriented towards England, where the Hamburg merchants had a representative office and privileges as early as 1266. You're getting a sense that when you make a reference to something like Hamburg or the free and Hanseatic city of Hamburg, you are incorporating a lot of history over the centuries. The Federal Republic had a chancellor, he was quite well known, by the name of Schmidt, who was from Hamburg, and I knew him here. When I was president of Stanford, he came repeatedly to visit here. And Schmidt once wrote about his hometown: "I love this city with its scarcely concealed Anglicism in form and gesture, its ceremonious pride in tradition, its mercantile pragmatism that is accompanied by an endearing provincialism." Now, but for the provincialism, of course I'm not provincial, come on. But for the provincialism, I identify with the other elements, a kind of pragmatism and a pride in tradition. I emphasize all of this because it was the local environment rather than Germany that meant a lot to me when I was a kid. Now, along with many members of my age cohort, I also chose a European identity. The early 50s were the days of Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet, the framers basically of what is now known as the European Union and what began as a European coal and steel community. And back in 1954, even a European defense community was planned. That's kind of interesting because it never happened, and they are now talking about something like that again. After the two world wars that began in Europe, I was part of a generation whose theme was never again. And it remained the theme, and it is still something that has a real presence in the way I look at the world. Now, serendipitously, Europe turned out to be the sine qua non of my first trip to the United States. And, well, I will say something more about that in a second. In 1953, I participated in an essay competition organized by the Hamburg chapter of the Union of European Federalists. And my essay won me my first trip abroad to France. I had never been anywhere, and I was 15 at the time. Somehow, the essay I had written for this competition had come to the attention of the Hamburg Board of Education, and when they had to nominate, also in 1953, a student to compete for becoming the German representative to the 1954 New York Herald Tribune Forum, Youth Forum, they chose me, and I was then picked in Bonn to represent the Federal Republic in the United States. More about that later. That's a very, very important part of my education. We all know that we could write our autobiography as a compelling story in which everything follows more or less logically from something else. I am inclined to acknowledge the role of serendipity. I was in 9th grade when an upper-class student in my high school mentioned the European Federalist essay competition to me and suggested that I should participate. Without that encounter, it is unlikely that I would be standing before you today. Highly unlikely that I would have come to the United States, or maybe much later, but end up here was not part of it. Serendipity in life is a very important element, and you can fashion yourselves as much as you want. Serendipitous events happen, and you have to, of course, have the openness to seize them if they are in any way looking interesting to you. I take you back to my school days. I'll talk about the New York Herald Tribune Forum in a few minutes. In the fall of 1945, I was enrolled. In the fall of 1944, I was enrolled in elementary school, and in 1949, after entrance exams, I entered at the age of 11 what in the Hamburg school system of the day was denominated as high school, a public prep school. The school was later named for Albert Schweitzer. It still exists. And I want to say, and I hesitate to say this at Stanford and in a college context, but the crucial educational experience of my life was this school. The first co-educational high school in Hamburg, led by an immensely gifted pedagogue, a woman by the name of Erna Stahl, whom the Nazis had imprisoned for her opposition to the regime, and whom the Americans had liberated from prison in April of 1945. In addition to the usual academic subjects, there was a strong emphasis on the arts, from music to acting. In music, I did not succeed terribly well. I did not get beyond playing the recorder, but I had to do at least that. And every homeroom had its own orchestra, so I played the recorder. But that is not part of, I love music and I go a lot to concerts, but performing was not one of my strengths. However, acting was. And so we played a lot of theater while in school. And I remember, for instance, being cast as the Marquis of Posa in Schiller's Don Carlos. Schiller's Don Carlos is a wonderful play about the then Crown Prince of Spain under Philip II. And in it there is a person who kind of is, even though is an Enlightenment figure, Enlightenment, I'm not using it technically now, the Marquis of Posa. And so this gave me my first opportunity to ask Philip II of Spain to grant freedom of thought. The Stanford motto, of course, comes to mind immediately. It was, in a way, my first invocation of the wind of freedom. I said to Philip II, recognize the wind of freedom is blowing. I'm very glad to know that one of the seminars actually takes its title from the Stanford motto. Also, emphasized by Waldorf school pedagogy, with its emphasis on a holistic integration of subjects, we were treated to what in English is known as block teaching. It was basically, block teaching was the multidisciplinary analysis of an era. Thus, when we covered the 17th and 18th century in European history, we simultaneously, in our English classes, read Hobbes and Locke. In German literature, we encountered the German Baroque drama. In music lessons, Bach, and in gym, we danced the minuet. A school trip took us to Vienna. High school was demanding and immensely rewarding, as it opened our eyes to the political and cultural context. That background stayed with me throughout my life and has played a role in my commitments to the arts and humanities at Stanford. For me, high school, especially grades 10 through 13, we had 13 grades, especially grades 10 through 13 was my liberal arts education. Now, all the more important because German universities are really differently organized, and I will get to that in a second. I understood really, as I went to high school and graduated from it, I understood that one cannot have a real understanding of the human condition in your own home country or anywhere in the world unless one is exposed in depth to what we call the humanities, to the arts, and I would add the social sciences, because a few things need indeed to be quantified about the world. And I'm kind of dismayed by the fact that in American high schools and in American colleges, not obviously in this room, this plays a decreasing, ever decreasing role. Now, to contrast this with the university, when I entered the University of Hamburg, as one did, these are all public institutions. My school was a public school. The university is a public university. When I entered the University of Hamburg in 1957, I was initially disappointed and underwhelmed by my first exposure to higher education, and I will come back to that. But I need to remain roughly in the chronology. I need to return for a moment to New York. So in 1954, the winter of 1954, I was the German delegate to the New York Herald Tribune Youth Forum. The New York Herald Tribune was a newspaper, a fairly major newspaper. At that time, the New York Times still had a competitor in New York. And its then owner, Mrs. Reed, believed very much in doing something about brother and sisterhood, and so she had arranged for 30 kids from as many countries to be invited every year to New York and spend 3 months with American host families. The participants in the forum, the so-called delegates, came from a huge spread of countries, from Asia to Europe, and of course this is, think of it, 1954, the war had ended only 9 years earlier, and there I was with an Israeli delegate and somebody from Jordan and somebody from Lebanon and somebody from England and France and so on. It was just those encounters were of incredible importance really for my education and my growth. But in addition, we were divided up and stayed in host families for 2-week periods. So I began in Rockville Center, New York. Anybody here from Rockville Center? Ha! Yes?
Like Long Island?
Yes, yeah. Yes, yay! Good, wonderful. So that was my first exposure to the United States, South Side High School.
Yeah!
Yeah! Great, that's wonderful. So there, 2 weeks on Long Island, then 2 weeks in Springfield, New Jersey, then 1 week at Millbrook School, a private school on the Hudson, then 1 week in Taft School, then another private school in Connecticut. Then we were all taken to Washington to meet everybody important in Washington, beginning with the president, then Eisenhower, and then 2 weeks in the Bronx, and another 2 weeks in Massapequa, Long Island. 2 weeks, always new families, totally. Anybody who can survive that can survive any anthropological challenge, I guarantee you. I mean, it was in some way wholly irresponsible to send these little kids to these different backgrounds, but I don't think it did me any harm or any visible harm. I had an interesting, one of the problems I have to watch, somebody has to watch the time. I have some, obviously I have a text as you see, but I also tend to ad lib. So the other day I was going through papers of mine, And I found a letter I had written in 1954 to my parents from Washington. So we were in Washington, we met the Democratic leadership, the Republican leadership, the president, and so on. And I wrote to my parents, you know, this was at a time when German politics were very antagonistic. The tension between the governing party and the opposition was extreme at times. And so I wrote to my parents and said, Washington is really inspiring. The way they interact with one another, the Republicans and the Democrats, is so incredibly civil. I wish the Germans would learn something from the Americans. We have come a long way. We have come a long way. As I mentioned earlier, I entered the university in the spring of 1957. German higher education had two significant features. The first, it shared with the rest of Europe, and that is, after graduating from high school, you specialized immediately. So you went into engineering or law. It seems to be that most Stanford students also specialize immediately these days, but that's another story. And so you went into your specialty, and that is what you did. You could enjoy the resources of the university, but it was all kind of on your own time. And so I studied law. And it began immediately in 1957. The second feature of German higher education was that students were free to move around German universities. So in my third semester, I had just spent my first year in Hamburg. I went to the University of Freiburg in southwest Germany to study with a very famous legal philosopher. That was the reason I had gone there. And you could just, this is very hard for us to imagine, but you could just pick up and go to the other place and say, here I am, and now I'm going to take classes at this university. The system has, since demand for higher education has sharply increased in Germany as well as anywhere, this is not quite working that way anymore, but there are still remnants. Now, I had chosen law not because I was interested in law, but because I wanted to enter the Foreign Service. And the prerequisite at that time for entering the German Foreign Service was to have studied law. And so here I did it just for the purpose of joining the Foreign Service. An interest that you can obviously trace back to the New York Herald Tribune Forum and my experiences there. And however, I went in my third semester, I went to Freiburg, and my direction changed completely in the second year of my education, where I discovered the intellectual challenges and relevance of legal studies broadly conceived. During my first day at Freiburg as a third semester student, I later went back to get my PhD in Freiburg, but during my first day at Freiburg as a third semester student, I went to a well-known professor of constitutional law, his name was Konrad Hesse, and asked to be admitted to his advanced seminar. He thought that could not be done. He said, these are all advanced students, doctoral students, and so on. No, that cannot be done. But eventually he yielded and assigned me a paper on the subject of judicial review. By the way, in there is also a lesson for all of you. And in particular, of course, as you enter the university, you will sometimes be shy. In the end, you are responsible for picking the subjects you want to do and be ambitious and go to, as I did, go to a professor and say, I want, because you are interested in what he does or she does, and I want to have a chance to study with you. And that succeeds much more often than you might think. do please take the initiative, is what I'm saying to you. Hesse's seminar had a profound impact on my future. It taught me the value of small group interactions. Normal law courses in German universities had hundreds of registrants, many more. We were sometimes 400 in an auditorium like this. And of course, the seminar had a much, much smaller group. It also taught me that even a beginner could benefit and could contribute. It also kindled my interest in constitutional law, and finally it made me desire an academic career. So this is a crucial semester in my life, as it were, because I changed direction completely, abandoned all notions of entering the Foreign Service, and instead pursued an academic career, or began to. As you know, I was responsible, as Dan suggested in his introduction, I was responsible for Stanford introductory seminars, and that approach was important to me and is still important to me for theoretical consideration. There was, at the beginning of the 19th century, a great intellectual figure in Berlin by the name of Wilhelm von Humboldt, who had a deep influence on my thinking about higher education. But I also want to say that you have these these introductory seminars is to some extent also a function of my experience as a third semester student in Freiburg. I was just convinced that the more you were challenged early on, the better it could be in terms of outcomes. So while I wouldn't say Hesse caused Stanford introductory seminars, there is some kind of a connection, at least on the emotional level. After my legal state exam, I took a step that brought me closer to life in the United States. I went to Yale Law School for an LLM, a Master of Laws. And the year I spent at Yale was extraordinary. We have to admit that, even if reluctantly, there are universities other than Stanford that do a good job, at least occasionally. And my year at Yale, as I said, was extraordinary. Among other aspects, it strengthened my interest in constitutional law and history. I had applied to attend Yale upon the completion of my law studies in Hamburg because of an interest in the work of Harold Lasswell, one of the leading behavioral political scientists of the 20th century, who was on the faculty of the law school, and there jointly with law colleague Myers McDougall taught a course called Law, Science and Policy. The policy part of the course put forward a systematic, value-oriented jurisprudence that claimed to be empirically based. Now, I had gone to study with Lasswell because he was a professor, but of course life is full of chance events, and Lasswell was spending that year in Hong Kong. And